How do you actually learn a foreign language to fluency? There's a lot of apps, a lot of opinions, frankly, a whole lot of noise about this subject today. What I'm going to teach you in this video is a method that's efficient, enjoyable, and actually works. It comes out of my experience trying a lot of tools and techniques and not being successful. And that drove me to study the common aspects of those that were effectively learning foreign languages to fluency. Those studies drove me deeper in the field of research to look into second language acquisition theory, and from there I came across a method that I was convinced worked. I had the opportunity to apply it, learn German. I had about 4 months to do it. I took the method, studied about 50 hours a week, and passed a university level German fluency exam at the end of it. So in this video, we're going to talk about this method.
Before we jump into that method, I want to talk about where most of us are today. And that's generally one of two camps, either learning languages in an academic environment like high school or college, or using one of the many language learning apps out there on the market. In both cases, people are not being successful with these approaches. I would challenge any of you watching this, if you hear someone recommend a language learning app, for example, just ask them the simple question, do you know anyone that's actually used that to get to fluency? So often, it's been the case in my own experience when I ask that question, the answer is no. And we ask the question, why is it? Why are people not being successful? And when I was struggling, I thought maybe actually getting to fluency is something that's only for the hyper gifted. Maybe language learning is really hard. Most people just aren't able to get there with any reasonable amount of time. Now, language learning takes effort. There's no denying that. But to say that it's only for savants to learn languages, foreign languages to fluency, that's just not true. And that's good news for us. The problem is actually the method. During the course of my research, I came across a linguist named Stephen Krashen, who spent his whole life studying how we acquire languages. Particularly, he was interested in how we acquire second, third languages. And this field is called second language acquisition. And the decisive conclusion he came to from his research is the way we acquire languages is when two things come together. We have exposure to the language and we have understanding at the same time. So the exposure and the understanding are connected. What do I mean by exposure? That would be like hearing a native speak the language, reading a book in that language. Now, of course, just doing that on its own is not effective. You could listen to hundreds, even thousands of hours of a podcast in some foreign language, and you wouldn't acquire the language listening to that because, as far as you're concerned, it's just nonsense that you're hearing. All those sounds, all those words don't have any meaning. What's necessary is not just exposure. Of course, it's absolutely necessary. You can't learn a language you've never heard, but you need understanding as well. And it's that connection. It's when our brains make that connection. That's how we acquire languages. Now, he gave an academic name to this theory. So when we speak about exposure, he calls that input. It's the language flowing into you. And when we talk about understanding, he calls that comprehension. So from this, we have the comprehensible input theory. A theory that the way we learn languages is by having language flow into us and at the same time having some way that we can understand what we're hearing. So if that theory is true, the question is, how do we put it into practice? When I ask that question, a lot of you are probably thinking, I know what the answer is. It's immersion. And that's actually a common misconception. Immersion in itself does not result in language acquisition. Now, we all perhaps know stories of someone that immersed themselves in a culture for a long time and they learned the language. And there's a reason for that. But the reason is immersion happens to be one way to get comprehensible input. You're hearing input all day if you're thrust into a foreign culture. And you have to understand in order to survive. So you're going to end up getting quite a few hours of connecting exposure with understanding as you go along. But it's not immersion itself that leads to that success. I plan to make a video about this in the future because so many people think that's the thing that I need, when in reality, what you need is exposure and understanding. You need input and comprehension. But to get practical, what does this actually look like? Well, you would find content that interests you in the language you're trying to learn with text and audio. with some translation of that content. Ideally, you have a way to translate individual words as well as entire sentences. And what you would do is you would first listen, with your eyes closed, through the piece, then listen and read it, and then listen and read it and look at the translation. And what's happening when you're doing that? Your mind's learning how to associate the sounds with the written language, and most importantly, both the sounds and the written language with the meaning, using your native language. So you would listen and read and translate, and do that process in reverse. By the end, trying to get to the point where you can close your eyes and listen and understand at least 80%, and then you move on. Now, even when I said 80%, some people are probably thinking, shouldn't you stop only when you understand everything? And that's a common misconception. We tend to bring it from other subject areas like math or science, but languages are organic. They're not learned like algorithms, and rote memorization or grammar drills aren't really effective ways to learn. The way that you actually remember words and phrases is seeing them in different contexts over and over again, and eventually they stick. Now, if we went back to the 1800s, what would this look like? Well, you'd find a book that interests you in the language you're trying to learn. You'd find a translation of that book, and a third book, which would be a dictionary between the two languages. You would do this juggling act between the three, reading and translating. Of course, the main problem there is you wouldn't have audio. So perhaps you would hire someone to read to you out loud. You would go out and speak with native speakers. But when you go out and speak with natives, the problem was a lot of the things they say go over your head. You can't even decipher the words, let alone the meaning. And when that happens, we have exposure, but we don't actually have understanding. And so in that slice of time, there's no language acquisition happening. There's no learning happening. Now, some people tried to corral this 3-book juggling act, and they created these books called graded readers. It would have a story, say in French, if you're learning that, have the translation into your native language, and then grammatical as well as notes about individual words in the margins. That had an advantage of not needing 3 books, but it was actually a step backwards in some ways because the content wasn't living anymore, it wasn't interesting. And so much of what makes language learning effective is when you're engaged and when you're interested in the content. And the good news is today, with modern technology, there's a very effective way to apply this method where you're able to have the living content that interests you. You're able to have very efficient access to translations, and best of all, text and audio at all times. Now, if that's the case today, the question is, why are people not being successful? And we have the technology, yes, we have the methods, but the problem with a lot of these language learning platforms that have been built is they're not built from the ground up on a methodology that's effective. They have an interesting idea, they go after a good user experience, which gives a sense of progress, which helps motivate learners. None of those things are bad in themselves, but they didn't go to the foundations of how we actually acquire languages and then build a platform on top of that. And if you look at the school system, for example, they teach languages in a way that's easy to test rather than what actually promotes acquisition. An example of that would be, what are the easiest things to test? Well, they would be grammar and vocabulary lists. And a classic high school Spanish curriculum in the US would include a lot of those two things and not very much comprehensible input diving deep into content that's interesting to you. Now, when I was learning my first foreign language using this methodology, I noticed there was a gap. There just weren't tools available that enabled you to apply the method effectively. So I built them. Pretty soon friends asked if they could use them too, and out of that grew Langfontes. Langfontes is the platform that enables people to experience the beauty of language and learn faster than anywhere else. I welcome all your thoughts, feedback, questions, because ultimately my goal is to make you successful in learning foreign languages to fluency. By the way, I'll be using this YouTube channel as a forum to discuss language learning theory, practice, and everything in between, so definitely subscribe so you don't miss anything.